Hi, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I hope you and your families are doing well and safe. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Cherry Mendoza, and I am from the Dubai Future Foundation. Before we start with the session, I just wanted to tell you a bit more about Area 2071. So Area 2071 is an initiative by the Dubai Future Foundation, which is a manifestation of His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum's vision to institutionalize future shaping. And our mission in Dubai Future Foundation is to collectively imagine, inspire, and design the future to make Dubai a leading city of the future. And here are some of the projects or initiatives that we have in Area 2071, which includes Dubai Future Research and Area 2071. And if you're wondering what Area 2071 means or 2071 means, it represents 100 years of the UAE since its inception in 1971. And part of its vision is to become one of the world's leading nations by 2071. It's an innovative ecosystem that is purposely designed to deeply connect the private sector, talent, government to co-create the future. And how do we do that? We do that through programs. So some of you may know that Dubai Future Accelerators is our flagship program. But aside from Dubai Future Accelerators, we also hosted some other programs like the Smart Dubai Blockchain Challenge, the AI Venture Lab Microsoft Accelerator, the Techstars Accelerator. And we also have some upcoming programs from the private sector. So if you want to know more about these programs, you can visit the website programs.dubaifuture.gov.ae. And aside from the programs, because we aim to create a vibrant community in the ecosystem, we also host activations and events to encourage the community to engage, interact, and grow. And one of a good example of that is the session today, our webinar on the future of space, which is going to be discussing about space policy and emerging technologies. And this one is hosted by our team from the Dubai Future Research together with the UAE Space Agency. And without further ado, before I hand over the mic to my colleague Aruba, I just wanted to inform everyone that you can submit your questions in the Q&A button, and we will try and answer your questions before the end of the session. I'll hand over the mic to my colleague Aruba. Enjoy the session.
Hello everyone, so thank you for joining us for our webinar today on the future of space, space policy and emerging technologies. So Dubai Future Research, the research arm of Dubai Future Foundation, following the Emirates Mars mission, has just published its report on the future of space, in which we look at different technologies and new research projects developed by scientists around the world, which will help us eventually live on Mars. So if you're not a space expert, because I'm not also a space expert, you might be wondering that this sounds like an overwhelming prospect or overwhelming aim. How can we live, or why would we want to live on Mars? Especially right now when it seems like adventurous to even travel to another country. How would we travel to another planet? More practically, you could be wondering, okay, but we're doing these Mars mission. What is the benefit to our economies and indeed our societies of space exploration and research? So if you have any of these questions, that's great, you're in the right place, because our expert panelists are going to help us break down some of these bigger questions and understand that space research and space exploration is actually more critical than ever at this time. So before we get started, I would like my expert panelists to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to go around the virtual room based on how you're appearing on my screen. So Jorge, can I ask you to introduce yourself?
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Jorge del Rio Vera. I work for the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs and as a scientific affairs officer. What we are actually doing in the office is to try to help countries in developing capabilities related to space.
Elodie, you're
Uh,
on.
uh, yeah.
Maybe you are on mute.
Sure, better like that. Hi, everyone. I'm Elodie Guillerme. I'm managing the Aerospace and Defense Accelerator Program at Hub 71 in partnership with the UAE Space Agency and Mubadala VC. And our objective is to scale and grow a startup system in the UAE related to the space, aerospace, and defense vertical.
Thank you, Aruba. I'm Talal Al-Ghaisi. I'm an advisor to the Director General on strategic projects at the UAE Space Agency. And don't let any of this fool you. I'm not an expert in space. I don't think anyone really is an expert in space. I think for me, I can speak for myself. I'm an expert generalist in general. So I try to understand a little bit more about what I'm trying to sell. And I can tell you for a fact that technologically, we can actually go to Mars today and live there. It's about political will and capital that I think are inhibiting that reality from coming to fruition anytime in the short term. So thank you for having me today.
Yeah, I love that. Such an ambitious statement. We're going to get back to that later on in the webinar, definitely. Nasser?
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for organizing this. I love the topic. I like the link between that you just mentioned in your introduction. My name is Nasser Al-Rashidi. I am with my colleague and friend Talal. We are part of the UAE Space Agency. I look after space policy, space legislations, and the education element as well. And recently, of course, I'm following up on a program related to incubation and startups.
Great. So now that we are all introduced, I want to kick off our discussion a little bit closer to home. So Talal and Nasser, if I can ask you to just give us a bit of context. What does the UAE's Mars mission that was launched last week mean for the UAE's strategic vision of space?
Sure. Nasser, would you like to
Go ahead, please.
So I think from a strategic perspective, this was something that was a mission accomplished before it was even launched into space, because there are two types of objectives we had for the Mars mission. One was the mission objectives at large, and then there were the science objectives, which we can literally look at as a bonus, because that's something that's completely out of your control in terms of what happens beyond launch. But the mission objectives were to build human capital and to try to inspire STEM education and to get to a point where we evolve as a country in terms of the expertise that we had in space, especially the Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center, who had capabilities with satellite manufacturing for Earth observation satellites in low Earth orbit, and then evolve into that next step of an interplanetary spacecraft. So I think the mission of the government in terms of those different aspects were accomplished by virtue of the launch vehicle having the spacecraft on the launch pad, despite a pandemic that everyone had no idea we were going to go through, and overcoming all those different challenges that were to do with getting to where it is today. And so then the science objectives are going to be what I think carry us forward in understanding better and answering questions that have been unanswered in the past about the Martian atmosphere in particular. Because this also tracks well with the UAE's objective and ultimate vision of 2117, which is a 100-year plan to have a habitable settlement on Mars by that year. And so this is kind of a generational type of endeavor. And this is one of the Emirates Mars mission. Hope Probe is one incremental step in that overall ambition. And it will allow us to understand not only the Martian atmosphere for that eventual settlement potential, but also understand in terms of the impact that took place on Mars to allow it to become what it is today, how we can learn knowledge that's applicable to the potential fate on Earth if we don't look at things like climate change, mitigation, and other aspects. So I think there are multiple different benefits to this mission.
So I don't know if I can add a few points in here. I think Talal has well articulated the mission accomplished. But one thing I wanted to add is that the space agency came after space activities in the UAE. And so as probably you've heard before, fully aware that our activities in space as the UAE started more than 3 decades ago, but they weren't a program. It was different activities, successful, thank God. And of course, they were meeting specific targets for that particular operator, for that particular university, for that particular government entity, but it wasn't a program. And what we have done as a space agency here was how can we bring all these activities to become a story, to become a full program that actually is going to sustain the growth of that program. And the second thing that was important for us, how can we maximize the benefit of any space activity we do? As you could imagine, when one activity is done by a specific operator who doesn't have an overview of what's happening in the whole sector, it is very challenging for him to maximize the benefit for it. And the role, as mentioned by Talal, of the space agency here is how can we stretch the dollar? How can we bring the maximum out of that Mars mission? Which, as highlighted, the scientific part definitely is a big thing, but the strategic part, to maximize that benefit, you need a full picture of what's happening in the program. You need an orchestrator behind that. And I think the space agency, along with Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center, played a very good role in here to maximize that benefit, not only within the UAE, but regionally and even globally. So one thing I also wanted to mention in here is that when we started the space agency, and probably Talal will remember this very well as well, is that I remember in one of the senior management meeting, the chairman told us, the ex-chairman told us, guys, we are running 3 races here. We need to establish an agency. You have a sector that is up and running, and you want to catch up, and not even catch up, you want to be ahead so you can able to pull him and support him to the next level. But you also need to prove yourself and bring the UAE into the international space map. Mars mission, we believe that the 3 missions were accomplished. The 3 races were accomplished. We proved the space agency, we proved our space sector, and in particular, Markaz Mohammed bin Rashid, but also the other players who participated and contributed here, we're taken to the next level. And we think we are becoming part of the global map on space exploration.
Yeah, I definitely think that's a really good point, Nasser, because this mission, the successful launch of this mission, has really kind of pulled the UAE up into the international space community to say that we are now actually live, we're active, and we're doing some really making some milestones for the global space community. So I just want to touch on some of the things that Talal and Nasser, you've just mentioned, that we have this long-term vision of kind of building a STEM-based human capital here, of developing a scientific community in the UAE and eventually living on Mars. What are the policies that I think you're kind of alluding to in your comment that will help us get there? Because we've defined the aim, we've defined what the races are and what the objectives are, but what are the different policies and regulations or kind of steps that we have to take to actually, get along in these races and achieve these objectives?
Talal, you want to take a shot first, or?
You're the policy expert, but perhaps we can.
You are an expert generalist, as you mentioned. You know everything.
We're both the experts for this discussion.
Why don't we do it this way? Because I think it would be good for the public to understand on a global picture, on a global scale, how this is looked at, and then bring it down to the UAE level on both a stakeholder and a government standpoint. So from a global standpoint, I think Jorge is best positioned to tell us about the UN's endeavors in this domain, and then both Nasser and I can talk on the domestic, and Elodie can talk as a stakeholder and as a representative of multiple stakeholders in the industry. So I think, Aruba, if you agree, we can go that route.
Yes, definitely. So Jorge, on to you.
So thanks Talal for volunteering me. Actually, there are quite a number of policies and instruments at international level that are decided in the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, which is a committee that is in the United Nations, where countries meet to discuss space affairs. And actually, they also discuss how they are conducting science, technology, and policy at national level. Out of this committee, there are a number of treaties that have stemmed out. Those treaties are basically setting up the basis for international space law, and actually are helping countries to structure their national policies. I mean, we have the Outer Space Treaty, which is probably the most famous, that is talking about no appropriation of outer space goods or bodies, but there are also treaties that are related to the registration of objects launched into outer space, for instance. The recent work of that committee is dealing a lot with the sustainability of outer space, which is very important if countries in the world want to conduct missions, or like UAE wants to establish the habitat in Mars in 2117. We have to consider that it is possible for any country to launch an object into outer space, but if we are not doing it in an orderly manner, if we are not trying to preserve the environment of a space, we may end up not being able to access space, nobody. And as the Outer Space Treaty is mentioning, space is the province of humankind. So those elements that are dealt at the international level are then transferred into national level, and the countries, the ones that have to put the policies that are related to those in place. And definitely United Arab Emirates, it's doing that very well. I mean, having a space agency is actually helping a lot to have an interlocutor and experts coming to the committee. So that's helping a lot also into translating international law into the national reality, which is very important.
Thanks, Jorge. I think that you touched on some of the most important points for the international kind of global scientific community on what space exploration would really mean. Because if I understand correctly, space is still right now international territory. It's not really defined or kind of designated to one country or one agency or national mission that's gone and kind of highlighted or marked space for themselves. So it's something that we really need international cooperation to kind of explore and kind of bring the benefits back down to Earth.
And definitely, and one thing that, I mean, that might be interesting for the people that is watching is that in the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space, it's not only about developed countries. I mean, currently there are more than 90 countries part of that committee, and many of them are developing countries because space is transversal, it's cross-sectoral. So it's very important for the countries to harness those benefits.
So maybe I can bridge between what Jorge just mentioned and what I think Nasser is going to mention by provoking everyone's thoughts and making this kind of real. We talk about policy and regulations as a very dry topic, but in space it's actually extremely exciting because the topics we're actually dealing with, think of this example. There are hundreds of millions of asteroids in the asteroid belt, near-Earth asteroids between the orbits of Mars and Jupiter. On these asteroids there are resources. So they're so rich in resources, platinum group metals, water, and water in spaces like oil, by the way. And you can actually find water in the form of ice on both the moon and Mars. So these types of things are ripe to be mined by not only governments, but more so commercial entities. And so as Jorge mentioned, there are rules on an international level about appropriations. But when you look at space as the benefit of humankind, and you think of the potential for it to be treated like open waters in the sea and the sea law where fishermen can go out on boats and any fish they capture, they don't own the sea, but they own the fish that they capture and can commercialize it. There's an ongoing discussion, I think, on an international and multilateral level today of how to treat space resources and whether those trillions of dollars worth of goods, whether you end up using them to bring them back to Earth, which I don't think really makes a lot of sense, or more importantly, using them for potential settlements in space, using them there so you don't have to take everything you need with you from Earth. So perhaps now would be a good bridge for Nasser to talk about how the UAE views these topics and what types of laws we have enacted in this regard.
Thanks for the transit, Talal. It was very difficult to move from the big picture, let me say, the international picture that mentioned by UAE to move directly to, because there is so many things to jump on from there. But let me say something that building on your argument, Talal, as well as what I heard from Aruba. That is, when I came to the Space Agency, I was like, boy, this is really tough. You are trying to regulate curiosity. You're trying to create some sort of policies for the unknown. You are trying to put some rules for exploration. You're trying to put some strategies for innovation. I mean, these are supposed to have no limits. And some of them, we don't know them. So who is me to put or to suggest something to regulate something that shouldn't be regulated anyway? So then we come up to a couple of things that was discussed also internally at the Space Agency with senior management, is that first of all, we need to understand that we are doing things in here. When we say policy or regulation or law, it's there to enable. So we don't regulate for the sake of regulation. If it does not require to be regulated, don't do anything about it. So we do something to enable curiosity, to enable innovation, to enable further human exploration, not only around Earth, but also to deep space. So we're there to enable that. The second thing, the way we think that we should be enabling that is through two principles. I think I mentioned it before, but I will re-emphasize them here, which is we want to maximize the benefit out of space. So if there is a, let's say, a particular, let's say the example of Mars mission, I want to make sure that whatever we're doing on here, or let's say any project that we do in space, how can I involve as many people, whether within the same sector or outside the space sector, to maximize the benefit of it within the UAE or regionally or internationally. So this is, for us, is the key enabler that should be emphasized through our policies and regulation, because that will enable the second one, which is very important, second principle, which is to sustain the growth of the space sector. So those two principles were the guidance for any policy, any law, any regulation that we have: sustain the growth of the space sector, maximize its benefits. Any strategy that we came up with, whether it's the national space policy that was there in 2016, that highlighted our principles and what do we want. The strategy 2030 that was issued in 2019 with 71 initiatives. It talks about the same thing on how we can implement that. So it's more of initiatives rather than high-level goals. But again, the driver is two things. Now, I remember one key question to end with that I got from one of the students and we are very happy about, in one of the programs in Sharjah University that is teaching space and aviation law and policies. And one of the students came to me with a question saying, Nasser, can you, you worked in the, and that was one of events that we have in launching our national space strategy. He says, can you, offline, can you summarize the strategy in very brief? I said, look at the vision. You should be able to, to understand the summary of the strategies and the vision that the UAE to become one of them. I said, no. I want it in one word. I was like, give me two. He said, okay, 2 words. I said, sustainability and partnership. What we're trying to reach here is sustainability of the space program, sustainability of space and outer space itself, sustainability of Earth. And partnership, if we say in business, location, space says partnership. Partnership at intra-sector between Space Agency, Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center, NTSCSC, Sharjah University, Khalifa University, within the sector. Inter-sector, which means, with education, with environment, with transport, but also international.
Thank you, Nasser. I think that the 2 words that you kind of used to just highlight the whole vision, which is a massive kind of aim and objective, are actually, like very strong, because yes, you're right, exactly. Sustainability, not only in the context that we need to have a sustainable space sector, so it's not just the government putting in money, but we kind of incubate and accelerate domestic companies, which then can kind of have sustained growth over a long period of time, but also sustainability in the context of improving environmental sustainability and kind of potentially using space technology and space research to mitigate climate change and make our environmental practices a little bit more sustainable. And the second point that you made about partnerships, that's exactly one of the key things that I think we need to highlight for our listeners, for the broader community, that space isn't something that we can do, one country can just do by itself, or that one company can just do by itself. Even if it's just a mission, if it's kind of mining asteroids, all of these different objectives that we have for space will have to be partnerships between different governments, between different companies across the public and private sector. And that's really one of the main kind of enablers, and also one of the main aims. So it's the means to the end and the end itself. So on both of these points, I want to bring in you, Elodie, just to kind of indicate some of the kind of work that you're doing at the accelerator to connect the public sector and the private sector, boost these partnerships.
Thank you, Aruba, for the transition. Yeah, I totally agree. Like, I've been a director of partnership for the last 15 years in the big corporates. So I'm totally convinced about partnerships, especially when, as Jorge was saying, when we are talking about space, you know, we're talking about the future of mankind. So that's not something that you do on your own in your small corner. So what we do at Hub 71, we try to support the objective of the UAE Space Agency, as explained by Talal and Nasser. And the idea is really to leverage what the UAE Space Agency is trying to do. First, on one side, to create a SME and startup ecosystem dedicated to space. And the idea is really to attract, you know, like the best startups from all over the world, not only in the UAE, we are totally international, and to bring them to the UAE. And I think that even if the UAE was not seen in the last years as one of the tech hub, talking about startups, for the space vertical, now it's growing, and we will be launching our next cohort soon in September. And I can tell you that we had a lot of applications from all over the world. And as you were saying, the idea is really to, the UAE Space Agency and the UAE government has a lot to offer to startups. What is very interesting for them and for our last applicants is that we are able to fast track things. We are able also to work with an agency which is very new, very young, which is very open-minded, which is not, I think, I don't want to do any competition there, but which is bringing a new vision on the space sector. And that's what we're attracting a lot of startups for our next cohort. The other vision is regarding sustainability and partnership, because I'm totally convinced that the idea is not, you know, when we're talking about startup, innovation, ventures, we have this example of SpaceX. You have one SpaceX. But at the end of the day, it's about partnership. You don't try to disrupt a sector like space by your own. So what we are trying to do, and I think this is a key offer from the UAE government, because this country has been built for partnership, is to bring in the same umbrella, you know, of our accelerator program, on one side, the government and the regulators, because we're talking about sovereignty, you know, and as you're saying, Jorge, you will not do what you want to do. So we are able to bring the regulators, we are able to bring the different government agencies, we are able to bring the big corporates, because at the end of the day, you know, when you launch your startup, it's not only about innovation and tech, it's also about sustainability, meaning economic sustainability and business. So the backup and the partnership with the big corporates are also a very important angle. And of course, on the last side, the investors, because we need money to grow this kind of sector. And the money should not come always from the government, you know, like we can launch successful and profitable venture in space. This is feasible. So of course, people have this big vision, you know, of we will go to Mars into 171, but we will be all dead. Why should I do, you know, like a startup trying to tackle this angle? And the point is that a lot of the startups we are working with are just trying to push R&D. And we know that at the end of the day, you know, the most disruptive technology that change our life, our day-to-day life as like pure consumer, were coming from space and defense. So that's why we want to grow that sector in the UAE, from the UAE, and to address a global market and not only a regional market, because space is not regional at the end of the day.
Thank you, Elodie. I think you touched on some really, really important points, especially just how you mentioned that a lot of the kind of revolutionary technologies that we have now were actually, people might not even be aware, were developed for space missions, like laser technology, smartphones, laptops, cancer imaging technologies. So there are so many things kind of we owe to space research and exploration. I just want to touch on another point that you mentioned, that you're kind of fostering a whole ecosystem or a sort of sector or industry of startups. So what are the different kind of cross sectors between space and space technology and other sectors that you're seeing applications to by different startups that are not just kind of working with space tech, but the applications of space tech in other sectors?
May I say something here, Elodie? And I want to bridge.
Of course, yeah.
I want to follow Talal's steps. I'm going to bridge between you and Talal because that's your area, you know. But I want to just mention, Aruba, in your introductory, you talked about future and vision. So I just want to highlight that, and then I think you will easily, bridging to both what Elodie and Talal will mention. When we look at the foresight of space, we use in our humble view, we see the following. We see universal data. What do we mean by universal data? So no more global data or big data. It's a data that integrates between terrestrial data that we are aware of, but also all the type of space data. It's a data that doesn't only talk about Earth, but even integrating Earth with other planets and other celestial bodies in the world, and take all of this into account. It's a data that will be utilized not only for Earth, but also to be utilized in space. This is one aspect. Universal communication. So it's not just about communication back to Earth, to another part of the Earth, but actually communication between space and space. Communication on other celestial bodies. Communication and IoT between the different satellites, but also back to Earth and so on. Universal transportation. So not just, the normal just rocket all the way to space, but actually start thinking about transporting something from one place to another. The next level of transportation within space or space to Earth, not just only Earth to space. Universal, what we say, energy. So moving from just, utilizing the normal energy resources here on Earth, but whether use the same conventional in space, but also try to come up with new resources and new, means and technologies to be used in, longer life in space. Last but not least is universal resources. Today, we're thinking about the resources here on Earth, but what about the resources that exist in space? And how can we maximize the utilization of this? This is the future foresight in summary when we talk about, the future of space and where we're going with that.
So thank you, Nasser, because that's kind of like the broad, long-term objectives that we have and that we're going to achieve through these space missions. But like Elodie said very rightly, for a lot of our stakeholders, or a lot of even just kind of the different parties involved in building an ecosystem, they might very well be saying, these are universal goals, or these are universal technologies. It's so broad. Like, if we're going to achieve them over the long term, why should I care right now? Because as Elodie said, and like a very famous economist once said, in the long term, we are all dead. So what are those like very practical technologies or kind of businesses and kind of value adds that we're kind of seeing today, right now, and our, for instance, in the accelerator applications from startups, what are the smaller problems that they're trying to solve? technologies that they're trying to deliver. Elodie, if I can.
So what is very interesting with space is that we've been in touch with a couple of companies coming from the food sector and coming from the energy sector. And when you think about like a space dedicated accelerator sector, you know, they were reaching out to me and telling me, can we apply? Because we are not like purely in your sector, but we could leverage space and space research. Because these guys were working on so disruptive technology that if they want to grow and scale, you know, their minimum valuable product, they need to showcase also that this is feasible. And the point is that if you want to use a new technology for food preservation, for example, or food growth, it will be very difficult if you really want to change the way it's produced. You need to tackle all the stakeholders from the current sector because they have interest in not moving the things and staying like as it is for economic purposes. But what we are able to provide with the support of the UAE Space Agency and MBR is to try to to highlight these kind of new technologies and to use them for space. And from there, bringing, you know, the right focus on this type of technology and moving and showing that there is an addressable market here on Earth that would be able to attract investors, because that's what we want to do at the end of the day. We need investors to scale solutions. And that's in our top, we've not disclosed yet the finalist, but in our top solution in the space domain, some were coming from the energy sector and coming from the food sector.
Yeah, and I would echo what Elodie mentioned and what Nasser mentioned. I think it's all about trying to figure out how to induce value creation for several different industries. And I think there are a variety of ways you can do that. I think the investment in space exploration, as you rightfully mentioned, Aruba, have many ancillary benefits and derivative benefits that are outside of the space sector. So we've seen that as a product of even the Apollo missions back in the 50s and 60s, where you have direct technologies that have been kind of created or induced by the investments in space exploration. And this continues to this date. Now, when we try to leverage other industries, and I think one of the questions that I saw here alludes to how can the UAE find a niche that we can become a major contributor to the global space exploration effort. I think that's where we try to lean on what we have strengths in. We have a vibrant aerospace industry from a supply chain standpoint with things like Strata. We have a vibrant aluminum smelting with Imal and Dubal. There are things that you could really look at. Energy as well, both on traditional energy, with mining, as well as renewable and alternative energies such as solar and nuclear. And all these things can be kind of further enhanced when you look at it in the context of space exploration. And then those enhanced versions could have terrestrial benefits that can be monetized. And that can then, rather than you try to follow the money and try to attract the money, you can have the money follow you if you're creating enough value and incentive for those adjacent industries. So, there's the Earth observation, big data type of aspect where you can then sell municipalities some images from satellites. That's great, and so is synthetic aperture radar, a new application of how you can monetize this type of data. But even for space exploration efforts, you can find ways that you can directly tie them into existing industries that we have in the country and we excel in the country, to where we might be able to bring something to the table that's quite novel from a global perspective. And that's kind of where we're trying to maneuver our sweet spot as the UAE.
And if I may, to complement what Talal is saying, and to make the bridge with the work of Nasser and Elodie, companies, when we are talking to companies in the United Nations, and sometimes we have industry days, what they want is to have equal level playing field. And that's something that you get if you are putting policies into place and you are regulating the effort. Actually the market. If you don't have that, it's very difficult to a company to actually decide on a strategy, because things may change along the way, and that's very difficult. That makes it very difficult for a company to plan for the future. And when we are talking about the vision that UAE has for 100 years almost, you have to have those rules very clear if you want to think strategically and for the future. That's very important. It's not rules for the sake of rules or for the sake of bothering companies. It's actually to give them the opportunity to all play with the same rules and with the same opportunities.
I think, Aruba, there are a couple of points that were mentioned, and I will re-emphasize them by Talal and Elodie, which is, if you like to say it, it's about spin-in and spin to great extent, which means that we try to, as much as possible, see what technologies and applications that exist today in other sectors, and how can we benefit from them here in space and apply it. And at the same time, the other way around, when we are doing, for example, our missions, not only that we are providing direct services to other sectors, but also we see if there's any of our technologies can be spun off. Very quick example, yesterday or this week, Elon Musk has announced one of the technologies that will be used for solar panels for the roofs. I don't know if you had a chance to see it, with a very attractive design. Now, we know that the solar panels that Elon Musk is utilizing as well is meant also for creating energy in the deep space as well. But there is also, you can see a spin-off coming from there to be utilized also for our clean energy, as well as sustainable homes and things like that. In addition, under these panels, the way the generated power will be stored and then later on reproduced and so on, it's also using a high-tech generator that is also building on the same technologies that Elon Musk is also trying to develop, whether it's used today on Tesla, but also in the future, it's looked at to be engines for the rovers that will be on deep space with a very efficient manner. So this is an example between spin-on and spin-off that is driving needs today on Earth, but at the same time meets a very long vision onto the exploration and deep space exploration. And this is what I was trying to highlight when I was thinking about the foresight and how you may start from a spin-in, but then while you are going farther, you start doing a spin-off and you still continue into your end destination and space missions.
Thank you, Nasser. Actually, that's a really interesting kind of framing of the cross-sectoral benefits of space research, that there could be a spin-in and a spin-off benefit for companies that are maybe, like Alidi said, working with food security, or working, like you mentioned and Talal mentioned, with energy, solar energy, for instance, or nuclear. Like one of the really interesting examples we have in the report is of a carbon utilization technology, which was designed for a spacecraft going to the moon or going to Mars to recycle the carbon dioxide exhaled by astronauts, but then with applications on Earth, because we need to reduce our carbon emissions on Earth. So how can we recycle and reuse carbon dioxide, even just like across our homes or in different countries? I'm being pressed now for a time because we are reaching the last 15 minutes already of our discussions. I want to open up kind of the panel to questions by our listeners. So I have a few questions that have come in here, and also if you can see any of the questions on the Q&A that you think are very, very important that we need to touch on, please feel free to let me know or just highlight them so we can address those for the listeners who've put them in. So I think one of the questions kind of is relevant to all of you. What is the most, one of the listeners has put in, what is the most important data that will be garnered from this space mission? So from the Emirates Mars mission, but generally for missions that we see, I think we can open up the question. What is the kind of data that we are collecting, and how is it useful for engineers here on Earth? Jorge, please, like all of you,
I can
feel
handle,
free to kind of...
Yeah, I can handle that pretty specifically to the Mars mission, and then maybe others can go broader. But specifically to the Emirates Mars mission, what we're aiming to do is provide a clear and comprehensive picture of the Martian climate. And this kind of gives scientists a deeper insight into the past and future of our own planet, as well as the potential for life on Mars and other distant planets. And this is something we're very proud of, because we're going to share the science data that we receive with the entire science community in the world, to have them perform their analytics on it and understand and interpret it in a certain way. And the idea is to try to understand better why Mars is losing its upper atmosphere to space, and track the behavior of the escape of both hydrogen and oxygen, which are the building blocks of water. So Mars once upon a time looked a little bit more resemblant of what Earth looks like today, with oceans and stuff. So we need to understand better what happened there to turn it to what it looks like today, for two reasons. One, because it'll help us figure out exactly what we need in order to try to make it something we can settle in the future, and also so that we can understand from that knowledge how that's applicable to Earth. And so we're trying to correlate between the lower and the upper levels of the atmosphere. We have three main instruments on the mission: an infrared spectrometer, an ultraviolet spectrometer, and an imager. And each one of those, and the unique orbit trajectory that this spacecraft is going to be operating in, is going to allow us to develop this full picture of the global picture of the Martian atmosphere. This is something that's never been done before, that will allow us to understand the atmosphere and how it changes through the day and between seasons. So this is kind of the most holistic type of data when it comes to weather on Mars that we've ever been able to accumulate from any prior mission that's been out there. So that's kind of what the novel part of this mission entails.
Yeah, thank you, Talal. I think that maybe that could be one of the most valuable forms or takeaways from this kind of mission, to understand how Mars came to be the way it is, and how its terrain and atmosphere became the way it is, and how we could even possibly have to mitigate a similar kind of evolution on Earth, because that's kind of a huge question for mankind. Jorge, if I can ask you, what is the kind of data that I know that the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs works with and collecting and sharing? Because I think one of my colleagues has been in touch with you earlier this year to get data for carbon emissions, for instance.
So we don't actually generate data, but we are kind of a connector, the gateway to several space agencies, to basically to connect for people or for countries that want to know what they can do for space, or if they have a particular problem to tackle in their own countries. They are coming to us, and we are basically routing them to the right places. I think that the question, not going a little that far than Mars, but if we are on Earth thinking of the contribution of space to our daily lives, and if you ask anybody about what would happen if you basically remove all the assets that we have in space, it's basically the result is chaos. We are using space almost for everything. We are using space for banking transactions. We are using space to help us drive. We are using space to help us understand the weather, the crops, to plan for cities. So space is a fundamental pillar of modern societies today. We cannot actually not rely on space anymore. It has become a critical asset for our societies.
I think that's a really interesting point. I think you mentioned a couple of months ago when you were here in Dubai that space is kind of like the new internet. Like, you can't afford to not be on it. You can't afford to not be a player or a stakeholder in this game. So yeah, thank you for kind of highlighting that. I'm just moving on to another one of the questions put in by one of our listeners. And I think this one is for you, Elodie, but all of you feel free to jump in. What is the support available for startups in the UAE trying to enter the space sector? I think we've touched on a lot of this, but maybe you can just give us like a brief understanding.
Of course, it will depend of your level of maturity, because at different stages, startups need different type of support. So I think the first thing is that now, thanks to a couple of initiatives launched by the government, we have now a couple of type of ecosystem of mentors, of people involved into space. that we are able to connect with if we think they are the best able to support the company. So that's something which is quite new and has been launched a couple of months ago. And also you have two types of programs which is supported by the UAE Space Agency. One is an incubator program, which is managed by Cryptolab for more early stage companies, and also trying to support, the students coming from the UAE University to launch their own ventures. And you have our own program at Hub 71, which is for what we call in our sector pre-series A company, meaning companies who have already a team, already potential contracts, who have already a project, what we call an MVP, developed, and that we are trying to help scaling their solution and also attracting investors. So that's the two teams that I know which are directly working. After, you have a couple also of projects run, as Nasser was saying, by the universities, and you have several universities in the UAE with dedicated program. You have R&D centers. Now you have several R&D centers. So I think that only in the last year, we've seen the sector really increasing with a different type of stakeholders. And just like, I think, just reach out to us. We are always available, and we'll be able to redirect you to the people who will be able to support you.
Thank you, Elodie. I think there are so many different initiatives that you mentioned that there's clearly a lot of support for startups or SMEs in this sector in the UAE. Just bringing us to potentially one of our final questions. Who will be the most dominant players in the space industry in the future? Companies or countries? As we have seen, there has been a shift from government-led initiatives to private sector-led initiatives. Who will be the dominant players in the future?
Can I try to answer this from statistics? So if you look at the international reports today that talks about the space economy, in one of the latest reports, we are almost about 360 billion is the total global space economy. And this is, by the way, a very conservative number. There are other reports that talks about almost 1.5 times this. But one of the conservative number talked about 360 billion for 2018. And when we look at there, the commercial aspect, the commercial revenue out of this is about 79%, of that number. So you could see already by numbers that the commercial elements in terms of the revenue of space is basically the dominant. Now, again, the word dominant in here is also a little bit sometimes could be misleading. The government has needs, has requirements. The government itself, in the end, when it does a space mission, is to be able to satisfy particular interest, a national interest, being a scientific or, a strategic or, something that serves an economic and national needs that no one else has taken, that role. So therefore the government launched that mission. But if there is today a company that is available in the market with innovators, with passion, who's able to provide that service, governments will be always happy to contract that company and make it happen, because in that case, that company not only is going to do that one project, but it can also continue and sustain and also find additional markets for its technology. So my point of view that I'm trying to make in here is that it's not one versus the other. It's what is going to happen is that governments are pushing towards privatization, provided the private sector is close enough to provide the needs of the government. But most of the governments, as we see today in the space agencies, are moving towards further opening up and become anchors to these companies.
And I completely agree with that. I might try to, I'll try, maybe unsuccessfully, but to explain it in a very relatable way. I mentioned at the beginning, space exploration, we're much more advanced than people appreciate technologically. I think the limiting factors have been accessibility to space and cost of access. So those two things are being addressed today. And because they're being addressed by innovative companies in this case that are enabled by government contracts. So like if you look at SpaceX with reusability, reusing a rocket is analogous to reusing an airplane, which is bringing down the cost of ticket, because if you don't have to throw the rocket in the engine each time, you're able to make much more money out of the operation on the full life duration of that infrastructure, as opposed to having to build a new one each time you want it to fly from somewhere to somewhere else. So that cost reduction is being enabled by some innovative companies that are pushing the envelope when it comes to technology, but that are enabled by the customer, which to a large extent is going to continue to be a government. And so if you think about it, the dominant force, I think, in the industry going down the line is going to be the common denominator between all, which is humanity at large. But it's going to be important for that political will to be there. And in order for there to be political will, then everyone has to feel vested in the importance of space. So you have to try, as an agency, it's our job to create awareness, to go out to different industries and show them the value, to go out to the general public, who in many countries pay taxes, and in other countries can look at, why are you spending this much money on space? You can be spending it on healthcare. We have a pandemic to get through right now. But the inspiration value that's brought out of investing in space, and the potential even technologies that are directly related to creating even a vaccine, pharmaceuticals being developed with R&D and microgravity on the space station, those are things that the general public don't fully understand are happening today. And that's what could get us more vested into space, and that's what could, I guess, help us move the needle in terms of the time it will take to have the right match between political capital and financing to get us to that next level when it comes to space exploration.
Yeah, thank you, Talal. I think that's kind of one of the key important messages that we're trying to highlight in the webinar, is that we don't just need governments or private sector companies. There needs to be a joint efforts, joint initiatives, but there also needs to be political will. There also needs to be kind of a vision, but also an end to the vision, into what are we all trying to achieve here. I just want to end with you, Jorge. If you could just touch on some of the most important things that are happening in the international space community in different countries that kind of the UAE can kind of work towards or partner with with different governments, different countries, or even different companies.
Well, before that, I mean, going back to the question that was answered by Talal, by Nasser, on who is going to drive the space exploration, companies or governments, I would say the driver will be ultimately people. It's no one of the two. It's ultimately people, because the things that are happening in space are actually to revert benefits back on Earth and back to people. I mean, nobody's, for instance, taking the example of hospitals, nobody's asking whether it can be private or public owned. At the end, what you care is about the service that people can get from it. And that's the important thing, the people who is going to be driving the needs. And in that sense, and linking back to your questions, what are other countries doing? Well, this is the year of Mars, because every 2 years there is a window of opportunity to launch missions to Mars, because we are getting closer to the orbit of the Earth, and the orbit of the Mars are putting both planets in a path that is short, is very short. So it's a good opportunity to launch to Mars. There is the UAE mission that has been launched recently. There has been also a Chinese mission that has been launched recently, and there is going to be a United States, a NASA mission that is going to be launched in a couple of days from today. So all those efforts integrate very well in understanding, as Talal mentioned, what happened in Mars that can happen to Earth, and how can we try to survive on Mars if we decide to go and survive on Mars and settle habitats there. All those technologies are putting us in the path of actually living there. And in terms of other countries, not talking about Mars in general, I mean, there are countries that are becoming spacefaring almost as we speak. The office, for instance, helped Guatemala to launch a satellite like 3 months ago. So there are different levels of countries that are trying to achieve their own milestones that are depending on their national priorities. So we are trying to help bringing them all together and to cooperate, because UAE, for instance, can be a very good example for countries that want to establish space programs, want to establish space policy, want to establish space agency. UAE can be a very good example of how that can be done in a sustainable manner.
Thank you, Jorge. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
The question that I saw in here, and I think when I see such a question, I can't hold myself, because that's a very important question.
Go ahead. Feel free.
The heart of it. That basically says, a person is asking a question, I'm not going to mention the name, but so in what way the UAE space program can benefit us in the UAE as an economy? You know, what does it mean today, you know, when we have a UAE space program? Is there any benefit that is coming from that, in, you know, tangible benefits that comes, and how is that program, in addition to all the inspiration that we are getting in here, what does it translate in terms of UAE economy? Now, I think all of us can tackle this one, and I don't know about the time, but for me, if I'm gonna just mention it in as a bullet points, one is that space provides services like telecommunication, navigation, imagery, and so on. So that's a direct one. Then you have, you know, in addition to that, we have jobs. Today, for example, in the UAE, we have 3,124 people, at least at least that was 80% of our entities that are working has this amount of people that are working in the space economy. You have technologies that come from space that can be utilized, and there is so many examples of that. One of the last records was talking about 30,000 technologies in space that are being utilized in our daily life, including the aluminum foil that we use in so many applications. STEAM and STEM education. So a key driver for that, if you see so many of the programs related to STEM or STEAM education today, which is, you know, about the engineering and science and so on, that you see space is in the heart of so many of this, because it really pushed people to that level. Last but not least, I would like to talk about security and disaster management. A lot of the security aspects today and disaster management for countries' interests are also relying on space. So there's so many examples of how space is benefiting the economy, and how the space program is eventually in line with an overall vision of the UAE as a 2071, which is the title of our, workshop today.
Thank you, Nasser. I'm afraid we are just a little bit over time, so I'm going to thank all of our panelists. You guys were great. I think that as a non-space expert, you've really broken down some of the key issues, and we've touched on so many important things. And I feel like almost the discussion still feels too short, because there are so many different big questions that we've just touched on that we could go into further detail. But thank you so much for joining us. And hopefully we can have another engaging discussion soon and see the UAE established as a key player in the international space community. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone, for the invitation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.